the whole vibe of this evening. So I think this panel sort of came together talking a lot of sort of conversations between The Verge and a lot of the folks behind Mr. Robot, talking about kind of a lot of the issues raised by the show and how it sort of made sense to tackle them. And so we thought we would bring together a lot of people who are sort of working in a lot of the sort of real life equivalents that helped inspire, what you see in the show, and just sort of talk about how that's all changing the world. So I guess I'll just go in order. This is Adrian Jeffries, my former colleague at The Verge and now managing editor at Motherboard, who's covered a lot of incredible sort of hacking-related stories you'll hear about. Molly Souder is of McGill University, currently at Data and Society, just a few blocks north, and author of The Coming Storm, which is an awesome book on denial of service activism. And then we have Matt Mitchell. There we go. A signed copy of The Coming Storm, owned by Matt Mitchell of Crypto Harlem, who's done a ton of incredible work in educating communities with crypto tools and sort of empowerment along those lines. And finally, Kor Adana, the cybersecurity expert in Mr. Robot and writer on the show, who can tell us a lot about sort of how some of the ideas in the show got there. I guess we'll start with you. Just I'm sure I've been asked that it be a spoiler-free panel, but lightly, I think it's not a stretch to say the show involves hacktivism and sort of familiar, I think for people following news, a familiar-looking group of sort of digital-minded activists, we'll say, who end up doing something that is both illegal and pretty world-changing, and pretty sort of aggressive in terms of changing the power structure of the world that we live in. I'm curious sort of what particular things in the world you guys were looking at and inspired you in writing the show.
Pretty early on, and I'm sure if Sam, our showrunner and our creator, if he were here, he would tell you the same thing. There were three big things that inspired him to create Mr. Robot. One of them was the Arab Spring, because he did have relatives over there that were experiencing the type of censorship that Anonymous eventually got involved in. Another thing is just hacker culture in general, and its portrayal in film and television has been something that we talked about a lot early on, that it was just cringeworthy and laughable, so we wanted to attack it in a realistic way. And I think that from a character perspective, and I think this is something that's common with a lot of individuals who are involved in hacktivism, there's this anger-driven defiance that I think our characters really tap into, and I think a lot of people who are relating to the show are catching on, are catching on to that, and I think that they make a connection to that. When you see an injustice in the world, and if you have even if it's a little bit of power to make a difference, and acting on that in order to make a difference, and joining a collective of like-minded individuals who want to cause change, I think the show does a great job of conveying that with F Society and their goal of taking down evil corp and the 1%. So I think a lot of it stems from that anger-driven defiance and paranoia and things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would kick things over to Matt just because one of the reasons I was excited to have you on the panel is you're working with a lot of the groups who are sort of out there trying to cause change in the world, and educating them in digital tools, whether that's encryption or sort of security more generally. I'm curious. Is that sort of defiance something that you see? How do you see that being expressed?
They are angry. They are defiant, and because of what they see happening to their fellow activists, they're probably a little paranoid too. So we reach it's an interesting place we are, right? Like we're in New York City, it's a bastion of like liberal progressive thought. And we forget that the United States isn't LA and New York and Chicago. The United States is a totally different place where we'll see like black and brown people being killed by security forces and law enforcement. And we'll see, we just celebrated on the 26th, gay marriage being the law of the land, but you're seeing all these states pushing back. So every time there's an advancement and you kind of push the status quo in a direction that we kind of like the collective we, there's always like a blowback and a push to go the other way. And we're seeing now that encryption and security tools are a necessary part of the arsenal of anyone who wants to be disruptive, anyone who wants to be political in today's day and age. Like in Cincinnati, there's activists who I'm in contact with who are like, hey, I got FBI just showed up at my door and like knocked on the door. Not just my home, but like some friends of mine, people I didn't know that they knew were associated to me. And there's kind of a chilling effect. And with these tools, people can like feel confident and continue to do the good work that they do and try to move things forward.
Which tools specifically, in case we have any troublemakers in the audience tonight?
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to turn the nerd dial down. So there's encrypted email, right? So that could be PGP. There's off-the-record messaging. There's a couple different platforms you could use, like whether that's this really nice, easy-to-use tool called Ricochet, or the classic one called Jabber, Jabber, right? There's mobile phone technology that allows you to like write a message without anyone reading it, or make a phone call without people intercepting it. Most popular one would probably be Signal by Open Whisper Systems for Android and iOS. Please take a minute to download that. These are the tools that I begin with. Like doing this kind of work, you drop in and you work with activists, you work with journalists, and it's kind of like Doctors Without Borders. You go in and you see a mess, right? And you want to fix everything, but you just have to say, look, everyone, just wash your hands. This is soap. This is warm water. This is how you do it. And then you just come back later and just try to like take it up a notch slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, Molly, I was hoping you could sort of talk to the broader picture of how that sort of, how we see that defiance kind of playing out politically, and we've seen sort of a number of, I'm trying not to lean on the term hacktivism too much, but do you get the sense that there is if you had to like assign an ideology to what we were calling defiance, do you get the sense that there's a coherent thing there, or is it sort of more abstract than that?
So the thing about sort of the hacktivist scene is that it's a set of tools and tactics that can be deployed in the support of many different types of ideologies. It tends to be a lot of what we would call the left, or sort of the more libertarian or potentially anarchist lefty politics, but that's not where it's restricted to. You see it also coming up a lot in more right-leaning circles. You see it coming up a lot in more nationalistic circles now. Basically, it's where the activists are going to be younger is where you're going to get a body of political actors who are familiar with these tools at a basic level, where they can pick up an iPhone and be like, I know how this works. Like, they know how to access certain types of services. They know how to access IRC. They have the time to learn how to access IRC. So you have these things where it's where the people have the time and where the people have the motivation. But the tools themselves aren't tied to an ideology. They're not tied to a specific body of politics. It's just, there's sort of it's where the political inertia is taking the tactical know-how.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really quick,
yeah.
without venturing into spoiler territory, some of the tools that have been mentioned thus far will be showing up in season 2 as well. So it's, I mean, it does inspire. It does inspire a lot of our story points. A lot of what's being discussed right now.
Yeah, totally. So, and the other thing that's interesting about it is you get a lot of these same tools and tactics kind of on both sides of the aisle. So we were talking before about Hacking Team. You're wearing their sweatshirt. As sort of a great example of both, like, a lot of these tactics being used to sort of enforce the power structure and then also being used to overturn that enforcement of the power structure. Well, I guess, do you want to just sort of describe what happened? This is like a couple years in the making now. And you've been working on this both as a reporter and now as an editor.
Yeah, so Hacking Team, if you haven't heard of them, is a company based in Italy. It started with these two Italian hackers who built this tool, hacking tool that a lot of people had a lot of fun with, and they got contacted by the police in Milan. And instead of saying, you guys are doing crimes with this hacking tool, we're going to prosecute you, the police were like, hey, can you actually help us hack people during our investigations? And they realized there was a demand from law enforcement for hackers who could help police get into suspects' computers and monitor their chats and turn on their webcams and turn on their microphones. So they built a business out of it, and it got to be 40 people, and was a pretty good business, and there are a couple of competitors. Gamma International is one, Finfisher is another one, VuPen is another one, of companies that have realized there's this demand in the market. And I first heard about Hacking Team at a talk by Chris Sagoyan at DEF CON, and I was just like, I can't believe this company calls themselves Hacking Team. There's no way this is really a real... But so I started looking into it, and it was real, and they got a lot of attention because they got hacked themselves about 8 or 9 months ago. They, on their Twitter account one day, was just like, hey, we decided to release all our emails. This was the hacker who had taken control of Hacking Team's Twitter account and was tweeting as them and like dumped 400 gigabytes of stuff that had been collected from Hacking Team's internal servers. So it was like all their emails. It was really embarrassing. They started bleeding staff. They're still around, but
Well, and like crimes, like export violations and stuff, right?
yes, and you know they always said like we only work with like good countries, like not oppressive countries who would use our tools against journalists and activists, which was bullshit. And so the interesting thing about the hack though was that the person who perpetrated it had hacked some of Hacking Team's competitors before, and came out and started doing interviews and said that it was like politically motivated. He put up this video explaining how he did the hack. He said like he wanted to empower other people to hack evil companies like Hacking Team, and he really believed that what they were doing was wrong and that this was an overreach by the state to be doing this kind of hacking of individuals, and he was very articulate. I think you're right to be hesitant about using the word hacktivism, because I think like with Anonymous a lot of it is inflated, and there are very few people who are like honest activists who are like willing to put themselves out there like Matt, and really believe in causes, and there are a lot of people who just like kind of jump on the bandwagon and are just like, let's fuck shit up.
Right. They
Sorry.
want the world.
And so, but this guy, the guy who hacked Hacking Team, he goes by the name of Phineas Fisher.
And we still don't know who he
You
is.
don't know who he is, yeah. He's very careful. He's very patient. He waited underground for 8 months before he surfaced and said, it was me. And so I think there's like not that many people who really like are skilled hackers, have political beliefs, and are willing to hack for them. And this guy's one of them. Jeremy Hammond, probably the other big example. Besides that, the Anonymous cohort, I think there are some people who are earnest in there, but there's a lot of like
Yeah.
13-year-olds.
Yeah. Teens. It's the teen threat.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things that you get, so we've seen all these sort of data dumps. Yeah, I wish there were a better term for it. But basically, like, you hack someone and then you have everything and you just put it all out there. And it's usually bad for the person because everyone has secrets. And one of the things that's seems to have come out of that is this idea that it's much harder to protect information than it is for someone to break in. You're sort of always outgunned. And it's like one of those ideas that I think people have probably been saying for a while and is now slowly trickling in to sort of the public consciousness and the consciousness of like people who run corporations and people who decide how you're going to talk to your coworkers and things like that. But it seems like we're still, if that's just the way things are now, we're still pretty early in that road. And I'm curious what you guys think, where like that takes us. If we really think that's just the way things are now, is that, like, what does that mean for society? Like, how are we going to have to do things differently? Yeah, go for it.
So I think like that leads us to a really interesting place, because there's a lot of people who believe in total transparency, a world where everything is made out of glass and you can see through all things. So it's like, because it's pretty abysmal, like the level of security most people have protecting their information. Whether it's, Fraternal Order of Police, which is a huge police union, which, no one knows who the hacker is that grabbed all their stuff and, worked with the Cthulhu to leak some of that stuff. Or the DNC, where now we know, thanks to, I forgot what they call it, like, threat.
Guccifer 2.0 or something?
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Yeah,
And it seems likely that, well, actually, Lorenzo, who for some other board, had a good, where people thought he was working for the Russian government, and he said he was Romanian, but he doesn't speak Romanian very well.
Right.
We
I think like
tried to interview him in Romanian.
Yeah, it didn't work.
Halfway through the interview, that was what was so diabolical about it. It was in English, and then suddenly it was just...
Yeah, but you see like a lot of those data dumps, right, happening, and we're going to see more of them. And knowledge is power, information is power. And there are a lot of people who believe that everyone in this room should have the same power of the people who work at a company or part of some organization. And it's really eye-opening once you see. Like, if you read the Fraternal Order of Police leaks, you'll see like jokes about Obama on their forum and like really sketchy police contracts. If you look at Sony's, data dumps that are on WikiLeaks, like really funny arguments about actors and their salaries. And I think that it's going to reach this kind of state where you can see anything. Because if you want to, you can access any data. It's very hard to protect that data. It's so much easier to get the data than it is to secure it.
But I also think there's an illusion happening here where it's hard to protect data, but also the protection that's being deployed is just laughable. So the Panama Papers hack that happened recently made massive headlines everywhere. They were running a WordPress and Drupal install that was multiple years out of date. And like, if anyone here knows anything about tech, Drupal is kind of horrible. It's good for certain things, but security-wise, it's just a terrible thing. WordPress, it was like an out-of-the-box WordPress install. That was what, like 2 or 3 years out of date? Something absurd. That a major law firm should not have had that, especially not a major law firm that specializes in helping various individuals dodge international tax law. Like, if I was running an international criminal conspiracy, I would not be doing that. And so it's both this combination of it's difficult, but also the people who are in charge of what have been essentially the background static of corruption upon which our world plays in front of. They're old. They're old. They don't know what they're doing.
Well, and so this is what you were saying earlier, was that the hacking war is the war of the young against the old.
It's a generational battle in many ways, where the old ways in which politics was done, the old ways in which the wheels were greased, they're graying out. Like, they're in their 50s and 60s. The people who are at C-level at these organizations don't understand what's happening. They don't know how to hire. They don't know how to retain talent. They don't know how to protect what they've been doing because suddenly the old ways are no longer working.
Yeah. I'm curious, Kor, we're talking about the Sony hack as news, and obviously, like, it's something that inspired you as a writer. But there's also, you're working in Hollywood. A lot of these people, I'm sure, are your colleagues, and at least if you zoom out far enough. I'm curious if you had any sort of personal reaction of oh my God, I hope my pitch wasn't in that one.
Well, I remember when that happened, I was working for another USA show, and I had a lot of colleagues who work at Sony, and their whole email system was down that entire week, and they were sending faxes. They were back to sending faxes for and everyone was worried. Everyone was scared. I did go through my sent box and made sure that I didn't share anything with any colleagues at Sony. But it's interesting. Sony specifically happened, I think, a couple of days before Mr. Robot got picked up got a series pickup. And it definitely influenced. Moving on.
We'll have more questions for you about that afterwards. Yeah.
But it's interesting because the notion of data dumps in general worked its way into our season 1 storyline strictly because of Sony. I remember we were talking about how to break that out into, and you see it in episodes 2 and 3 of season 1, where we do have Evil Corp data dumps, and it's a major plot point in season 1. It may or may not come back in season 2. But yeah, I do believe that we're going through this kind of transitional period where until you get the members of the younger generation in charge of securing this data and using some of these tools and making sure that systems are patched and whatnot, that this is going to keep happening, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things in terms of kind of the ideology of all this is the work of sort of crypto parties that you do. So I mean, you're traveling, it's not just Harlem, you're traveling the country and the world, sort of teaching people how to use these tools and secure their communications and sort of the kind of tricks of the trade. And I think baked into that is the assumption that the more people in the world who know how to use PGP, who know how to use OTR, that's getting us to a better society in some way, right? I mean, this is we're empowering people for the better, right?
Right.
And so I think, especially in a culture where I think from afar a lot of people think of hacking as a very scary thing, and I think, well, probably after San Bernardino, a lot of people who watch cable news would tell you encryption is a scary thing. I think it's very counter to that. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your motivations behind sort of why that's something you believe in, something you're working towards.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, you do have this kind of old versus young thing, but at the end of the day, you also have nation states, and the CIA has their own hacking group, the FBI has their own hacking group, the OTD, the NSA has their own hacking group, TAO. So it's reached the point where people have a lot invested in keeping things the way they are. So whether you're an opposition leader in Russia or a young activist in the United States Northwest, right? You need to know how to use these tools, and if you don't, you're going to be in a bad situation, right? In a sorry state. We look at FOIA requests from a lot of great reporters on people who are just doing the most democratic thing possible, which is like, okay, you taught me this. You said that if I tried to go to my congressman and they didn't listen, and I tried to go to my local police and they didn't listen, that I should assemble with my friends and hold a placard and walk down the street. But when I walk down the street, a stingray is pulling my phone number, When I walk down the street, automatic license plate readers reading my car. My face is being put in the FBI database, and biometrics are being kept and stored. And if you don't understand that this is the new age of being an activist, then you're going to get caught up in a lot of problems. And that's what we see from looking at the data that's heavily redacted, but it's there. So it's like photographs of, let's say, Russell's face from every angle, nice face. But, just doing what we're all taught to do as Americans, which is, be American. So I feel like it's so important. If you don't know how to use these tools, you're at a disadvantage. People are not in white vans listening to reel-to-reels of bugs in your land, Everyone's being passively surveilled in this country. We know that now. And in a lot of nations, it's even worse. So these tools are vital to keeping you alive and free and in doing the great things you want to do. And they can be taught in a way that's not too nerdy, and that's what we try to do with Crypto Party Harlem, and Stop LAPD Spying does that in LA, and Crypto Party Chicago does that with Freddie Martinez in Chicago, and I work with all those peeps to. I focus with marginalized groups. I focus with LGBTQ, right? Black, Latino, groups that are marginalized and over-policed and aggressively surveilled inside the United States, and the occasional human rights defender outside the United States. But yeah, it's important. It's important. Go to a crypto party.
Go to a crypto party. It's important.
Yeah. There's one at Harlem Business Alliance on Wednesday, so you can look that up.
You totally should.
I was talking to Lorenzo, one of my colleagues, today about this, and his feeling is that encryption tools are too hard, and that
He's not wrong.
it's important to tell your friends to use Signal, and I always get excited whenever someone else signs up on Signal and I get a notification, like every other app where it's like, your friend has joined whatever. I'm like, oh, stop notifying me. But with Signal, I'm like, oh, you can talk securely.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's funny you should say that, because I called Matt and I were talking before the panel. I was like, oh, here's one to come, and like, here's this thing, and we were talking over Signal, and I was feeling very clever. And then when you call someone, it gives you 2 words,
Right.
Yeah.
and you're only supposed to read one of them, and I screwed it up.
See, it's hard.
It's hard.
Very savvy.
I'm like normally intelligent.
Yeah.
As Adrian will tell you.
It is getting
But
easier, though,
so-
isn't it?
Yeah, it's getting easier, but Lorenzo's point was like,
Yeah.
WhatsApp turned on end-to-end encryption, and like instantly that it had such a huge impact on like how many people use WhatsApp.
Right.
Yeah,
It's
like
the number one
a billion.
messaging app in the world, right? But
Right.
it's still owned by Facebook. And if you go to facebook.com/records, oh, cool, it's law enforcement's front door to Facebook. And if you look at their global transparency report from their legal team, like 80% of requests, not just subpoenaed requests, they serve up. So if someone's like, I want Russell's post and all his messages directly to, Adrian, they'll, hey, there you go. So, not saying WhatsApp's...
But does Facebook have your WhatsApp messages? Isn't it end-to-end? So
It's
only-
end-to-end, so like the Brazilian government wanted WhatsApp messages of these 3 drug dealers, and Mark Zuckerberg was like, we couldn't give them to you if we wanted to, it's
Right.
end-to-end encrypted, but they have metadata. And they also have a backup feature that if you turn on, really compromises, the level of security you have.
But they can't read the content.
They can't read the content, but they can know that I've been talking to you every day before the
establish the
shipment comes in.
timeline, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't even blow up your spot by the shipment.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of these apps that are usable are owned by corporations, they're owned by major corporations. Gmail will tell you if you're sending email to someone doesn't use encryption, but you're using Gmail. Like, you're already inside a system, whereas the open source tools like PGP and GPG are much more secure in that way. They're much more politically secure, but they're also borderline unusable.
I mean, there's...
Like, unless you go to a crypto party and learn how to use them. Like, you get someone smart to tell you, but like, they're really difficult to deploy.
True. In my experience with PGP and PGP and specifically is that it's gotten a little easier. Like, if you're using an Apple Mail client, it makes it a little
It makes
easier,
it
but
a
it's
little
still
easier,
confusing.
But it's still confusing, and there needs, like, crypto parties are a great solution because you can go, you learn with your friends, you teach other people, it's wonderful, it's like Tupperware, but it's still a high price of entry.
I do think Signal is very easy to
Yeah.
use.
Signal's good.
I
And
think
also
Signal,
they've-
Wicker, a lot of
they've-
these mobile apps are
They've
really
squared the circle in that they have done these for hire, essentially, deployments with WhatsApp, where their code runs WhatsApp, and they got hired to make it all work. And they just did the same thing with Google's Allo, which is how they keep the lights on, but then they made their own sort of homebrew version.
Yeah.
Just to give a sense, so we said both PGP and GPG there. For people who don't use these tools, they made PGP is an open protocol, and they made a program that will run GPG for you on your PGP for you on your computer, and they called it GPG, just to make things simple for when we want to talk about this publicly.
PGP stands for pretty good privacy. That's
And
what it, like,
GPG stands for
GNU
GNU PG,
GNU PG.
and the privacy at the end is implied. It's really way harder than it needs to be because it's pretty simple.
Because it's open source.
Because it's open source.
But I love that the description of it is as confusing as the actual
Yeah,
use of it.
yeah.
Well, the most important thing is that if you send an email to someone, it's like sending a postcard. It's like, wish you were here, you know? But anyone, a mail carrier sees that message, right? And everyone who touches that postcard until it gets to your friend's house sees that message. And that's how every email you send is like that. So if you're not encrypting your email, that it's just open. But if you encrypt it, it's like dropping it in an envelope, and you seal it, and it just says from this to that, and only your friend gets to read the message. So not encrypting a message, which most people don't do, is just leaving a message for anyone to read, right? There's a million servers between your inbox and your friend's inbox.
So one of the other interesting things is it's sort of, if in fact these tools are getting easier to use, which I think they are, it does start to change the culture a little bit, right? Like I think for a long time just IRC, right? Just being on IRC, even though that's not like, in fact, that much of a security upgrade, although I suppose it's better than email, was sort of, okay, you cleared the hurdle, you can hang, we're all here on IRC, everyone can hang. And I think, having a working OTR client is sort of like that, having a working PGP is sort of like that. As it kind of gets easier, how do you think that changes, call it hacker culture or security culture?
Well, I'll just
Well, I think it just becomes more mainstream. It's like rock and roll. Like rock and roll was once for the kids, and now it's not for the kids. Now it's just music.
or hip-hop.
Or hip hop, or anything that starts in a small, like isolated subculture. Once the things that make it accessible become more accessible, everyone starts doing it, and it stops being a subculture, it just starts being culture. And it's just going to become, like, fingers crossed, like it's just going to become like, oh, you don't use Signal? Oh, you can't sit with us. Like, it's just going to be expected. It's going to, like, fingers crossed, but like I said, like these things are actually, for a while it was a point of pride in the hacker community that these things were really difficult to use. It was like, yeah, well, I don't need a graphical user interface. I can roll with a console, I can do it myself. It's like, okay, but now no one else will do that. Like the actual political activists who have lives, who have things that they're doing, don't have time to figure out how to roll this on a console on their own. They don't have time to do this, and which is why crypto parties are so important, because it's about making time and giving the knowledge to people who can use it in a usable way very fast.
Yeah, no, I just got here from California, and there's a lot of like libertarian, like, I wanted my wet dreams to be Ed Snowden. But you have no real threat. Nobody cares about you.
Yeah.
All right. Then there's journalists who do good work, and there's activists who do good work, and there's just people in the streets who are trying to protest to save their lives and fight for the liberation of their people, and they face very real threats. And so, I've never been someone who's like, oh, it's hard to use. That's awesome. I think like the great thing about this OPM office, like the government leak of all this military data and government employee data, the Home Depot, like people's credit cards being taken, and Target, all those point of sales being taken, is that now everyone's been touched by this stuff, and security becomes a feature that you'll see. Like there's a privacy section in your settings for your iPhone, like and that makes sense to people, and you can like turn off a camera app from using the camera and things like that. And those are all amazing advancements that we wouldn't see before to answer that question. So I feel that the way that it affects the hacker community, I kind of don't care how it affects the hacker community, but I'm really stoked that it helps like real people, I don't know if the hacker community, I had this long debate about some stuff that was going on inside the hacker community, which the hacker community should be ashamed about. So, is it a bunch of people who have the same interest, or is there a community? Because if you're a community, you stand up together, you face adversity together, you look out for each other, right? If it's a club, like fishing is in the community, right? Then not so much. So I think the debate's still out, if you ask me.
But I also think that some things aren't going to change, and like the technology isn't in charge of whether or not you have data breach disclosures. That's not something the technology can fix. That's something that has to be fixed at a regulatory level. those of you who don't know, the only reason you find out about data breaches is if they impact people in California. Because California is the only state in the union that has data breach disclosure laws. It's the only reason you find out about it. If it impacts people not in California, you will not hear about it because companies have no interest in telling you how shitty their security is. And that's something that the tech isn't going to fix. That's something that can only be fixed at a regulatory level.
Well, and that, that's also, in some ways, this is like a little bit of a wonky government story, but what the hell? When that initially happened, when those laws were passed, and companies suddenly needed to start getting serious about securing data, it was one of the big moments of, okay, PGP is going to be a $100 million corporation now, we're going to start a security business and, move to Northern Virginia and join the complex. It was a huge, I think, turning point for people who wanted to do this for a living.
But we don't have code liability. We don't have a way of telling a corporation, if you build and ship shitty code that puts people in danger, you are liable for that. We don't have a way of doing that.
But at the same time, if your code is really bad and it comes out through media, leaks, FOIAs, etc., then you're not going to have a company anymore. So that is a thing. There are a lot of times when these vulnerabilities are found, and they're found by security researchers, not through the company releasing it, or sometimes the company calls the FBI, and the FBI actually releases some of the information. But I'm not trying to take over your job, Russell, but I do want to hear some Mr. Robot stuff.
Well, my one hope, even just with this discussion, my one hope is that just hopefully the show, and only time will tell if we're successful with this, hopefully the show raises some awareness with regard to the usage of these tools. It definitely, I think one of the reasons the show works is because the way that we communicate has evolved just due to the advancement of technology. So when your typical viewer, your layperson is watching how the show conveys, the behavior of an iPhone or rooting an Android or even unlocking their phones, they recognize it and they're like, oh, hey, this is cool. I deal with this every day, and the show is conveying it in a realistic way. What they may not know is the ways in which they're vulnerable. And hopefully the hacks that we showcase in the series, and just the paranoia and the tools for encrypted comms or whatever, even encrypting Evil Corp's data. Encryption is a huge tool at F Society's disposal in season 1. Just being exposed to it hopefully will inspire some kind of curiosity out there to explore the usage of these tools for themselves, which is my hope. Hopefully it's doing that. But what specific Mr. Robot gossip were you referring to that you wanted to hear about?
Go for it.
Okay, so at the end of the season, no spoiler, right? There's this cryptic ending.
I regret asking you this question.
What's your no spoiler interpretation? You could it could be a physical interpretation. What is that?
Are you talking about the coda, the post-credits coda?
Yeah.
I can say that any questions that you may have about that will be addressed in season 2.
Ooh, good answer.
I can say that. So, tune in.
There you have it. So one of the interesting things, while you were talking about sort of regulatory, and the government is required to mandate people telling you when your data's been stolen, right? One of the weird things about how the dynamic of sort of groups hacking corporations and things like that is how much the usual law enforcement and military sort of defenses don't really apply. That is, so if the U.S. government, or you were going down the list, NSA or FBI, if they want to get into my phone and steal my stuff, they can do it.
Yes.
But if the issue is, okay, these Russians won't want to know what I'm working on, and they just came in and hacked my phone, well, is that an act of war? Does the Pentagon care about this? Well, no, not really. Does the NSA care about this? No, not really. And also, just standard, they stole this money, the traditional law enforcement has not been really good. I mean, occasionally we see these big fancy federal prosecutions, but it tends to be really just like slivers of what's out there. And so I'm curious, I mean, do you think there isn't like a huge role for the state in all of this? It seems kind of like we're on our own with a lot of it.
Well, the United States is creating like this fifth armed division. You know, like there's like the army,
Cyber command.
right? Yeah, cybercom.
Cyber. Oh no! What? So it's. I actually heard. So I heard this from former White House official that the reason they liked it's a cyber domain, which means it's not just that there will be people in the government that can do it, but in the way that you would pitch like the army, like we're going to give you meals for land soldiers, or we're going to supply your ship in some way. You know, so the domains are land, water, air, space, and now cyber. But it also means you can be a cyber contractor, and so you will set up your cyber domain third-party contractor and sell cyber goods to all the different military apparatuses, and like.
You started this so we would have to say cyber a bunch.
Yeah, no. This is why you keep hearing cyber though. It's because they want to establish the cyber defense contract.
Yes, exactly. But the tools, the FBI's hackers, when they find a vulnerability, like for example, companies have these bug bounties where they're like, hey, kick the tires, and if you find a bug, we'll pay you money to reveal it to us so we can fix it. For example, I was just reading up on this Uber bug where you could find out anyone's trips from their first time they used Uber, where they are now, all of this information pretty easily. They patched it though, right?
Well, the guy reported it, right?
Yeah.
He used it because he did the right thing and he sent it in. He didn't use it for his own nefarious purposes.
Well, it's like
that we know of.
Well, there's like 4 types of hackers in my life, right? Like there's the black hat who's just going to sell it, but they don't care if some jealous ex uses their tool to kill someone. They're just like whatever for the lulz and for the money, right? Then there's like the nation state person who's like, it's for duty of my country, regardless of what that country is. There's the hacktivist who does it because they're smart, or more likely because they want to watch the world burn, right? And then there's like the kind of like, I wouldn't do anything bad, and having some money for my time is kind of nice, white hat kind of person. And I think like that pretty much, like not to make it so clean, like cuts it up. And with the nation states, they actually have a whole 25% of that pool. You go to a lot of these amazing events, like these tournaments, like the one that they have, CISA, Cybersecurity Awareness Week in New York, and it's sponsored by Homeland Security. And I've gone every year for the past like 4 or 5 years, and the military's there, and it's like, not to date myself, but there was this old movie called The Last Starfighter or something like that.
Oh yeah.
It was like a video game, and if you passed it, like you got asked to join this intergalactic league. That's what it's kind of like. It's like you play these games versus all these other people, like Olympics for hackers.
It's a talent hunt.
Yeah, it's like a talent hunt. Yeah. So I think there actually is a big interest there. There's weaponized tools that we don't know about and vulnerabilities that don't get published. The government sits on. And they get used against activists, and get used against reporters and journalists.
Like, there's a huge government interest, but you have to come at it from a couple of different ways. One, they've had a real problem hiring because you can't get security clearance, or you couldn't get security clearance until super recently, if you had ever smoked marijuana. Like, they had weird rules that worked if you were in the 1950s and it was the Cold War and what you wanted was good old boys from the same families who've been providing your good old boys for the past 150 years. But the hiring standards had to shift. Like, it had to change. They had to make it less difficult and less prohibitive for people who had actually had a life to work for these branches of the government.
But there's people who like just kind of turn state, like
there's people, there's always people
they're
who turn
taking
state.
care for a long period of time and giving some level of amnesty.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, that's in the United States. I mean, Adrian, you guys were talking to Future for 2.0, whoever he is. And I mean, even if he is working for the Russian government, or she, probably not like in a 9-to-5 capacity. I don't know. I mean, I'm curious how you see this. Is that like a national security conversation? Is that a cybercrime conversation? It's like a weird gray area, right?
Yeah, it's a weird gray area because the victim was not a government agency.
Well, I mean, the victim is like the DNC, so
a
that makes it
company.
even weirder.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're going after like
Well, it's like
very
if you're
like
talking about state
information
hackers,
crucial to the like U.S. political process, right? So like even that,
Yeah.
and like not to say that I'm going to bat for the DNC as like a crucial element of our democracy. Like it's not like they're hacking Congress or anything, but it's sort of again a weird. It's like a double gray area.
Right. Well, if you're talking about state hackers, then the Sony hack is also a good example,
Yeah.
where it's like not only a state, it's like a particularly sensitive state
Yeah.
of North Korea. I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. I think
Information exfiltration has always been sort of war adjacent. It's always considered to be the realm adjacent to kinetic warfighting. And
Yeah.
it will always be considered to be a thing that the state does. And so a concern that the US government has is establishing cyber as a zone of warfighting so that certain norms of warfighting can be deployed in what has been until recently a pretty civilian area. Like the internet is sort of widely considered to be sort of a civilian network despite its history as a military network. But if you establish it as a domain of warfighting, you can suddenly do a lot more stuff involving information exfiltration, involving surveillance, involving entering into what are previously considered to be private or business-oriented networks without really considering these other things.
I think it's going to have to be a much bigger attack to be an act of war, though.
Well, but that's something that is being actively considered. Is like so there's the question of can you ever react to a cyber attack with a kinetic response? And that's an ethical question that's being talked about in military circles now. It's being talked about whether or not Stuxnet counted as a cyber weapon or whether it was part of this other adjacent field. So like these are massive questions that are currently being debated, which haven't been solved yet. But it's all part of establishing the internet as a domain of warfighting.
Just out of curiosity, did you consider Stuxnet a cyber weapon?
I am going to embargo that until I finish the paper I'm working on.
Well, I'm going to say yes.
Yeah, I don't know what else you would call it, right? Like it's
you were like slowing down mechanical, like
maybe
industrial control
maybe we'd
systems.
say it's like espionage rather than like an act of
But
like
it's
It's an
military,
act of
but
sabotage.
It is sabotage.
So the
Yeah.
question is that a weapon?
Just so, well, I should give the
Which
back.
is a vastly
True.
different.
I should give the
Are
background.
spies soldiers? Like these are
Good point.
huge military ethics questions that can't be easily answered. And so
But if
they're-
you take out a hospital or you take out a factory, does it matter if you use a bomb or a USB?
in terms of the Geneva Convention, yes.
Well, I don't think that the United States government or the government of Israel or the government of Iran or Turkey play by those rules or care about those
This
things.
is also a valid
So,
concern.
you know, and also the nation states have been using the internet as this like, you know, for fighting or whatever, for decades, right? So there's no difference. I think like it's just about being able to get more money for surveillance on citizens of their own countries, to get more money for tools, and also to get, like the FBI is pushing for the ability to hack without having to say what they're hacking for, or like, you know, being able to just kind of basically hack at will, right? But they kind of do that anyway, but they want it to be policy. So I think it's really just about trying to get something in writing to reaffirm what they've always been doing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what's interesting to me about it is at a certain point, you know, okay, so this is the government policy. Obviously, like the military always wants, and intelligence agencies always want more authorization to do more operations, and that's sort of how the system works. But do we get to a point where, from the perspective of, okay, I'm just sitting here with my laptop, certain people want to do bad things to me that are somewhere on the internet. At what point does Google become more important as a policymaker? Like Google and, you know, iOS, right? Gmail and iOS. Those policies become more important as a buffer between me and you know, sort of whoever wants to steal my credit card number than like the policies of the US government, right? Or whichever state I happen to be in at the time. And if that's true, then maybe the whole parameters of the game are different.
But I I think that these corporations are, the policies of these corporations are already more important to the average citizen than whether or not Stuxnet is considered a kinetic weapon. Because these are the companies that people are interacting with every day. These are the companies that are holding your information. And these are the companies that the government will approach to ask for it. Like, they're not gonna ask you. They're gonna not go knock on Google's door and be like, hey, can we have the metadata from Molly's email address? And this is a very serious question, because it's about who you have, what do you consider to be rights? What are rights for? Rights protect you from the government. They exist as a mediating force between you and the state that you live in. With corporations, you have terms of service. You have contracts. Your rights are mediated not by the Bill of Rights, but by the contract you clicked through to sign up for whatever the newest versions of iTunes is.
But I feel like these companies owe a lot to the users who keep them, the tools are free because you're the product, and we're all selling our information, but we're not getting any change back. So, in my neighborhood, we have young people who, because of what they post on social media, they're told by Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, hey, come here, be yourself, express yourself. But then the FBI comes into your housing projects and drags you and your friends out, and then you end up sitting in Rikers waiting for trial, or caught up on some kind of crazy gang conspiracy charge, right? Yep. So, it's like, wait, but you told me I should post a video. You said I could put a picture. It's like, no, not you. So I feel like the companies owe something to the people that's probably more powerful than the laws of the land, right? Because you're saying there's free speech here, but this isn't a country. Facebook's not a country, it's a company. And that company is a lot of times used against the people who use it, who make money for it every day.
Yeah.
Who is Evil Corp based on? Is it Facebook or Google?
I was going to say we're just a few blocks away from G Corp.
I mean, it's the Enron.
It's the Enron.
Yeah. It's Enron.
It was originally Enron, but it can
do whatever you want.
Fit whatever you want it to be. That's the nature of it.
Well, on that note, maybe we should open it up to questions. Does anyone? Oh yeah, actually, we should. Who wants to take the microphone? I'll take the microphone.
Yeah, come on, burn some calories. Some Fitbit steps.
Just first of all, thank you all for your comments. Have any of you personally been targeted or hacked?
There's some wood.
I have not yet.
I would assume so, but I'm still finding out. So knock on FOIA request and see what happens.
I'm an academic, I'm really boring.
I have had creepy men come into my email and call my cell phone. I had my information included as part of the T-Mobile breach, which included my social security number. That hasn't manifested in a personal attack, but it made me feel like my most precious thing was included in one of these breaches. And then besides that, people try to get into my Bitcoin address all the time. I think that happens to everyone who has a Bitcoin wallet.
I had a member of Anonymous call my cell phone number, which he had no reason to know, but he just wanted to tell me a cool story.
Yeah, actually the guy who called my cell phone was really nice too. But he wouldn't tell me how he got my cell phone.
I'm extremely paranoid about, but it hasn't happened yet, luckily.
That you know of.
That I know of. Maybe it has. Who knows?
So do you follow your followers on LinkedIn or Twitter to see if they're Anonymous, Lizard Squad, or any of them? I'm curious.
I have a lot of followers who are part of these organizations, yes, because I write about it a lot.
Right. Or law enforcement.
Also law enforcement, yeah. Members of the military.
Thank you for all of this. This is like nerd heaven right now. This is amazing. One, I want to ask, what do you guys think about these people like Ross Ulbricht and Edward Snowden, who are now becoming the face of hacking? What do you think about that?
I think it's kind of like a pale face, so I think there's room for some diversity in that face of hacking thing. So there's so many women who work information security. There's so many people of color. There's so many black people. So many Latinos. So You know, we have our Harlow homes and tons of other people's like this, but sorry. But you know, like I think that we need to kind of broaden out that spectrum. And I know tons of people like for example, what's the name of that video game again? With there's a sequel to this game, and you're a black hacker in San Francisco, and everyone
Watch Dogs.
Yeah, Watch Dogs 2, right? So and all the haters on Steam were like, oh man, there's no such thing as a black hacker. But Morgan Mayhem is black, and John Threat is black, and I'm black, last time I checked. So, I think, like, those people, they have interesting stories. Cybercrime is one end of it, which is very easy to do, but hard to get away with, and Ross taught us that, right? And on the other side of it is, Edward Snowden, for the good and the bad of it, was someone who worked for the state, right? He's like a totally flag-waving army person who surveilled tons of people and listened to tons of people's recordings and watched tons of people's videos and had a kind of like crisis of conscience and kind of woke up and then decided to go rogue. But let's not remember that, like, he doesn't come from activist grassroots backgrounds, right? So I don't know, I'll just leave it at that.
Coming from like a social movements theory perspective, figureheads are needed. Like there's a piece of politics that says we need a face for this. Without a face, we can't have an effective movement. And part of that is just human psychology. And part of that, makes me feel a little uncomfortable because I'm like, well, if you have a head, someone can cut it off. It's like, and so it's interesting that Snowden now is like away and he shows up in his little robot at every conference and he gives his stump speech about freedom and equality. And I have some issues with that. I think that it's an interesting thing, and maybe it's important to have someone model the behavior of whistleblowing. But again, like, I'm glad he had his come to Jesus moment, but like he might not have.
Right. But there's
a
other
lot of
whistleblowers.
anti-Snowden sentiment on this panel. Russell wrote an editorial today saying he should get a pardon.
I mean, you're not wrong, but that doesn't mean that he's necessarily the new face of freedom.
I agree with you, Russell.
No.
I have one last question. I'm sorry, one last question. So, could you, because I read the Wired article about the whole case with Ross Ulbricht, and there was some kind of things at the end about how they caught him.
Yeah.
That were kind of sketchy. Like they said that there's no way anybody has a computer that you can just press a button and it's totally encrypted. Like, from what you know about how it happened and how he got caught, could you clear up or maybe use some of your expertise to clear up some of the vagaries?
Here's how he got caught. He went to the public library to log on to Silk Road, and everyone in that part of the library was a federal agent. So he opened up his laptop and he logged in, and he was like, I'm untouchable. They just visited him a couple of days ago. One of his aliases staying at a friend's house, getting some false IDs, and they took a picture of the screen because he didn't have like a screen filter on it. They saw like the admin page for Silk Road. They like pulled his hands away in case you can have a panic button. There's plenty distros that you can like. If I do this key command, everything's toast.
Well, you said you could shut he had closed it.
Yeah,
They got it.
They caught him like literally like grab your hand. Like if you're on the men's room on your mobile phone and someone puts the handcuff on your hand and keeps tapping on your screen, you're unlocked, right? So that's basically what happened. It's not too mysterious there. You get away with something for so long until you don't, and that's why you have to be really careful. Not like I'm giving you the cybercrime tips.
Interesting, just to add on to that, in doing research for season 2, the crew and some of the writers of Mr. Robot got to take a tour of the FBI field office in New York City. And we were walking through one of the rooms, and there was this box of evidence, and I saw this hard drive that had Ross's name on it. And I was like, holy shit, is that what I think it is? And the guy's like, yeah. So, I mean, that was a little nerd moment.
What's that say about season 2?
Absolutely nothing.
Oh yeah, who's next? Oh yeah.
I'll just talk loudly. I think like with Mr. Robot and then also like Snowden, Aaron Swartz, Anonymous becoming like huge topics that people are talking about, we're at the biggest point that like these issues have been at maybe ever. But there's still a huge disconnect between like public interest and then also in the government, like the fact that like the CFA is still what it is and that like war games is still thought of as relevant at all. So I'm kind of curious what else you think can be done by people that are interested to make issues of privacy like more relevant and maybe more trendy to a wider audience?
You should vote.
Well, or I think like if you're a creative person and you know, everyone works in the space, the realm that you're in, right? So if your lane is, you know, helping develop and write amazing scripts, you can put that into your storytelling, right? So, and it behooves us, every one of us who takes these issues seriously, to find your way to do it, right? Your way to help out and spread that message. And I think with creative stuff and visually appealing stuff, it's really, you get so many more people, right? Like, if I can just tell someone, like, watch Mr. Robot. Give me a background, you know? And they get it, right? I don't need to tell them to, like, okay, go get Gabrielle Coleman's book and read that, then get Molly's
Also
book.
read the others.
Yeah.
And then read my book.
Yeah, you know, like, and then, you know, check this out, then go to Motherboard and read these articles, and then, you know, email Lorenzo. Like, you don't have to do that anymore, and that's a wonderful thing. So I think it's like, you know, I'm all about people being empowered to be the change that they want to see. So, yeah, not to be all Michael Jackson, but man, you know.
But also, like, remember, like, when SOPA people went down, there were a bunch of people saying, hey, Congress, it's no longer okay for you to not know how the internet works. It's like, well, it's no longer okay for you to not know how Congress works.
Yeah.
Like, if you want CIFA to not be a law anymore, call up your representative and tell them so. If you're old enough, run for Congress. Just do it.
So I think it kind of got touched upon in the previous question in regards to like diversity and kind of like minorities within like a subculture. I'm currently in school right now. We've had like you know, wiki events that are like targeted specifically towards women because, you know, as many of us know, the demographic for that is skewed quite high to white men. I think like it's interesting, like an aspect of privilege gets pulled into hacking, although it is, you know, not as mainstream as you said. How, you know, if you're the access to certain tools, education levels, how inviting the environment is. Is there anything you guys can kind of like touch upon those aspects and how like that's been kind of like a guiding light or force, both positive or negative?
I think this is really important, and this is why saying like, oh, you should educate yourself how to use these tools, like, is never going to really be the humane solution, because there are always people who are not going to be educated enough or not going to have access to not going to have the leisure to be able to do that, and so that's why I feel like it's good to tell everybody you should educate yourself and use these tools, but it's never going to be a complete solution, and it's no good if like the knowledge of how to use encryption becomes this like elite power that a certain group can use to evade the long arm of the state and everyone else's.
Yeah,
I
like,
find it upsetting.
statistically, we see that like African Americans, Latinos over-index on mobile use, right? And they're like, you know, digitally dependent to their phones. But you don't develop code on a phone. You do it on a laptop and computer, and that's not in everyone's living room and bedrooms, right? So, or on a tablet. So, and you know, there aren't a lot of. And when you go to like, I go to like hacker conferences all over the world, whether they're in Hamburg, Germany, or like in New York City, or in Las Vegas, and you know, you're gonna see that same problem. But there are people who are challenging it. There's this group called Women Cyber Jitsu that's a Beltway kind of based DC group that tries to get women learning right 100% like about hacking tools. You know, there's groups like Roots Asylum, which tries to get kids, like young kids, right, learning about ethics and hacking, right. You know, when I go out into my community, I go offline. I mean, flyers. I you know, go to people's like, you know, barbershops and salons, because that's where people are. So if you know something about hacking or computers or tech, there's probably someone right behind you who doesn't know what you know, and you can actually just do something. You don't need to be an expert, because we need to fix that. You know, however, at the same time, I will say, you do see so many people who are like these bright examples, they just aren't giving the spotlight. You know, like, you know, there are countries where just outpopulate us, where there's tons of hackers, right? So those hackers, you know, like if you're in Pakistan or India or China, if you're in South America, if you're in the global south, like I meet tons of these African information security people who train opposition leaders and put their necks like literally on the line to tell people how to decrypt and use tools, etc. But they are not the ones that we see, you know, talking on magazines, things like that. So it's a complicated issue, but I think like it could be solved, and it belongs to the people to solve their own problems. Like, so as a woman who's learning this stuff, you know, that's awesome that you're doing that, and don't let anyone stop you, and look towards the younger version of you to get her into this.
Definitely, and I feel like this is another hope I have for Mr. Robot. For those of you familiar with the show, one of the most badass hackers in F Society is Darlene. Trenton is Iranian, and she's amazing. Romero is African American. I mean, we try and address this issue, and hopefully it works to inspire.
Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to know how
Wasted.
how's public acceptance or understanding of some of the things that you write about, how do you play that into the script? I mean, when you're looking at a global audience, how does that affect the way you write?
The public understanding of the themes or the technology?
The themes, and the technology. So different countries in the world have a different perception of the importance or the risk or the threat or the opportunity for that matter. How do you write that into your script to appeal to a global audience?
It goes back to some of the themes I was talking about from a character perspective. I think that no matter what country you're from, social anxiety and mental illness is something that you can relate to. And if you can get on this journey with Elliot and empathize with him, and you understand what it feels like when he can't really connect to a person face to face. He can't tell you what's on his mind. He's telling us, the viewer, what's on his mind, but he can't communicate to Angela, for instance, or he can't talk to his boss. But he can interact with a piece of software. He can sit in front of a computer or in front of a phone and connect in a way that is completely comfortable to him. From a humanistic standpoint, it's very uncomfortable for him to have a discussion face to face. So I think that's something that, regardless of where you're from, you can relate to. And I think that's part of why the show works so well, is because early on, even in that first episode, you're right there with him. And he's, I think it's partly like his way of connection is through the technology. And I think the more dependent that we are on our cell phones, our tablets, or our laptops, the more we can understand that.
So many hands.
So we're getting in a world where there's like sensors everywhere, and we're inviting like Alexa into our living room. Do you find that frustrating?
You personally? You personally?
No, not me.
Well, like your average American,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Do you find that frustrating in any way, that for a little bit of convenience you lose privacy or the expectation?
Well, I think the Internet of Things is a frustration for all people who understand security. So it's like people love hacking those things, right? Like, and exposing them and reaching out to like motherboard and saying, hey, I just like got this home automation system to do whatever I wanted on this baby cam. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. So it is very frustrating. And hopefully people like watch Mr. Robot is think twice about the relationship with technology.
There's no reason to have a refrigerator that's connected to your home network. Like, it serves no purpose, or a toaster, or even a washing machine. So some of these things are just nonsensical to begin with. There isn't really a need for it. So, also something that may or may not show up.
There's the question of there's no reason to have it, but there's no reason really to develop that. Like, there are two sides of this question. One is the consumer side, which is like, people are always willing to give up a little bit of privacy for a little bit of convenience. It's just sort of human nature, we're lazy. But there's also an ethical responsibility that needs to fall on developers and corporations to be like, maybe you shouldn't actually build that just because you can. Maybe this isn't something that's going to make life better. This sort of goes out as far as like, maybe Uber shouldn't institute a payday loan vendor within their employment system. Maybe that's not going to make anything better. And that's something that needs to be considered at a developer level.
But I mean, a lot of developers don't know application security.
Yeah.
From the day you write your first Hello World code to the day you're making 6 figures, no one's shown you how they can own your code or how to defend against your code, and that's a failing of the industry. And hopefully, we're seeing things that are shifting that. So hopefully there's more of them.
It's a failing of education, it's a failing of ethics education, and it's a failing of regulatory bodies because they don't have a legal reason to do it.
So this will probably be the last question, but yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your thoughts and expertise. My question pertains to net neutrality, because that was a big piece of legislation that just passed, and at least on my radar, it had sort of fallen off of the policy, and it wasn't so big in the media cycle and the news cycle, at least mainstream. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts about net neutrality and if that brings in new ethical responsibilities, or if it will exacerbate policy and be beneficial or otherwise. Thanks.
Well,
Net neutrality is good. We like net neutrality from sort of like a basic regulatory perspective. And again, this has a lot to do with various walled gardens and like what it means when you have a zone of communication that is entirely owned by corporate interests. So the internet is broadly defined as what is known as a privately owned public space. It's not a public space, it's owned by private corporations. You are subject to private rules and regulations when you are on the internet. And that's why network neutrality is such a big deal, because you cannot rely on systems of rights and equal access because it's not natural to that environment.
and if you don't know what net neutrality is, like a really basic example would be if T-Mobile lets you stream unlimited Spotify music, but like other providers have to like come out of your data plan.
Although they are
Which is
allowed,
like-
they are allowed to
Yes,
do
they are
that.
allowed to do that.
Title II does allow
Yeah.
them to do that.
Yeah.
So
But they can't do it on the wire.
This is the
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
the unsettled
This
part.
This is the
Yeah.
unsettled
Yeah,
part.
exactly.
Like so, and same thing with like zero rating. Like I'm just saying, like the battle continues, right? And zero rating is, hey, you can get this device, and it could go on like these 5 sites without a data plan, basically, unlimited Facebook and Wikipedia. These are all dangerous because what they do is they change the lens that you're looking at the internet through, and you're not seeing the same internet. You're getting a separate and totally unequal internet. In the neighborhoods that I serve, there's discount providers like Boost and Metro PCS, and there's tons of bloatware and tons of like strange like apps in there that you can't get rid of, and they're like, you know, they can make their own, let's say they made a Facebook app bigger than Facebook, right? So it's dangerous because the internet that most people fell in love with was it's good and it's bad and it's everything, and this device in your pocket is the questions and answers and research and jokes and horrible things and trolls of the entire world, right? Running on a battery that lasts about like 2 days. It's pretty amazing. It's like a piece of magic, and it's so important that we keep an eye on not just legislation, but on how companies try to get around things like net neutrality, or how they try to enforce things like zero rating, or how they try to implant bloatware, because it affects different communities differently in different countries differently.
Yeah, Facebook's internet.org is something to keep an eye on in this area, where it's like, it's their sort of way to bring the network to underserved countries, but it's Facebook's internet.
What phone are you using? It's 2-day battery.
Let's take it off.
Well, with that, yeah, thank you guys for coming out. I think we're gonna call it there. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions.